Over the years, weightlifting has used many different systems to decide who gets to compete at the pinnacle of the sport, the Olympic Games. In the early days, there were so few competitors that it was almost a case of if you turn up, you get to compete. But after a while, a system was needed to limit the numbers of competitors. Over the last few decades, the qualification has been mostly team-based, so countries earned points for the performances of their athletes at the 2 World Championships leading up to the Olympic year. Those points translated to quota places that each country could hand to their athletes. And countries that missed out at the World Championships were kind of given another chance to earn quota places at the Continental Championships on the Olympic year. And there was also some room for individual qualification based on another ranking list, but this was only afforded to athletes from countries that didn't earn any quota slots through the team qualification system. Now, there were obviously some downsides to this. From a fan's point of view, it was a shame not to see some of the top lifters competing more frequently. It was also impossible to not feel some level of sympathy for athletes who helped gain points for their country, only to then not be selected in favour of another athlete from the same country. However, the biggest problem with this team-based system was the suspicion that countries could hide away athletes from the international competitions, and then obviously the drug testing that came along with those competitions, and then just reveal these athletes after they'd qualified points at the Olympic Games. And so in this way, it wasn't actually uncommon to not see some of the top athletes for an extended period of time, and then they turn up to the Olympics and they break Olympic and world records. The doping issues in weightlifting really came to the foreground in 2012 and 2016 at the Olympic Games. And at those points, we saw entire countries excluded from competitions. And subsequently, retests were issued and the results changed and became almost unrecognizable in certain weight classes from what they were before these drug tests. For example, and I think most people have heard this stat said many times, and sometimes I think it's overinflamed to some extent, but in the current 94 kilo class from the 2012 Olympics, the current gold medalist initially finished in 5th place. And so obviously things had to change in order for weightlifting to maintain its Olympic status, and the qualifying process was one of those things that has to change. And this led to one of the biggest changes to Olympic qualification in living memory for the sport of weightlifting, and for any sport, in fact, involved in the Olympic Games. And so instead of it being team-based, as it had been previously, all qualification now would be individual. So every athlete who wants to go to Tokyo would need to earn points on their own by competing several times over the 18 months that preceded the Olympic Games. And of course, the weight categories were also changed, primarily to reset the world and Olympic records in order to essentially usher in or establish a new, supposedly cleaner era of the sport. And now this essentially is where complications began for the IWF, because they had created 10 categories for men and 10 categories for women. But the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, had decided that they only wanted to allow 7 male and 7 female categories to compete at the Olympic Games. And so a new method would have to be developed to allow athletes who compete in any of those 10 weight classes from the men's side and the women's side to be able to compete in one of the 7 weight classes that would be present at the Olympic Games. These requirements led to the development of a new system based on a new scoring method called Roby points. The idea was to put all athletes into 2 ranking lists, one for men and one for women, and then allocate places in categories to the athletes who scored the most during the whole qualification 18-month period. So I'll now briefly explain that system to you guys, but if you want to know more, we actually have a really in-depth article that goes through absolutely everything at weightliftinghouse.com, so I'll link that down below if you want to check that out to understand this system just a little bit more. So first I'll talk about how the system was supposed to run, and then we'll look at some of the changes that the IWF had to make due to the whole coronavirus pandemic. So this 18-month qualification period was supposed to take place from November 2018 at the World Championships, that would be the first qualifying competition, all the way to the Continental Championships in 2020. This 18-month qualification period was then split up into 3 6-month periods, and athletes had to compete in each of these 3 periods. So Roby points are the IWF's new official way to compare athletes across different weight categories, and in that sense they sort of replace the Sinclair system. Now, there has, of course, been some level of debate between the statistical validity between Roby points and Sinclair points, but Roby points does have some advantages, especially with regards to qualification ranking, in a way that the Sinclair system really doesn't. One of the main advantages is that Roby points reflect the modern rules of weightlifting, since lighter body weight no longer wins in a tie. Under the Sinclair system, a lighter athlete would actually receive more points than another heavier athlete in that same weight category who lifted the exact same total. But under the Roby point system, only weight category matters, and so two lifters from that same category who lift the same would score the same. So two lifters in the 96 kilo category, if they received the same 400 kilo total, but one of them weighed 95 kilos and the other weighed 90, they would receive the same amount of Roby points. And now the Roby system isn't actually too complicated to understand as long as you wrap your head around these two main things. The first is that if you equal the world record total in any weight class, you receive 1,000 points. If, however, you are only able to total 50% of the world record, you would receive just 100 points. And in that sense, the Roby point system is logarithmic rather than linear. So, for example, each additional kilo lifted awards you more Roby points than the previous kilo. So athletes turn up to these IWF approved competitions, they earn Roby points for their totals, and then they're ranked on them. Simple, right? Well, no, actually, because not all competitions are equal. There are three types of qualifying competition. The first is a gold tier competition. An example of this would be a World Championships or one of the 5 Continental Championships. If you compete at one of these gold tier competitions, you'll receive an extra 10% Roby bonus. The second is a silver tier competition, and an example of this would be IWF Cups, Games, and Regional Championships. And for competing at one of these competitions, you receive a 5% Roby bonus. And then finally, there are the bronze tier events, and these tend to be open competitions, often organised as part of existing national competitions. And for competing at one of these, you receive no additional extra Roby points. Now, it's worth recognising at this point that there weren't many gold tier events. You'd have the World Championships and the Continental Championships, and so whenever one of them popped up, you really had to do your best to make sure that you earned enough Roby points there. If, however, you were a junior weightlifter, you had more access to gold tier events because the Junior World Championships and the Junior Continental Championships were also gold tier events. And so if you were particularly talented as a junior athlete, you not only had all of your junior gold tier events, but you also had all of the senior gold tier events. So you had way more access to 10% Roby bonuses and 5% Roby bonuses. In order to be eligible for the Olympic qualification, every athlete had to fulfill certain requirements during qualification. The first was that each athlete would have to participate in at least 6 events, and that could be made up of gold, silver, or bronze tier competitions. The second requirement was that each athlete would have to participate in at least one competition in each of the 3 6-month qualification periods. And then thirdly, each athlete would have to participate in at least one gold tier event plus either one gold tier event or one silver event. Now, I've really carefully made sure I've been using the word participate rather than compete, because what does participate mean? Well, it basically means that an athlete just has to turn up to a competition and weigh in, and this ensures that they are subject to drug testing, but nothing else. So the athlete doesn't actually have to lift if they participate in a competition. They just have to turn up, weigh in, get drug tested, and then they can leave. And we've seen this happen quite a few times now where some of the top athletes and some of the middle and lower level athletes have been on the start list, turned up, weighed in, done all of that stuff, and then not actually stepped out onto the competition platform and lifted. It's worth mentioning that athletes cannot just do this turning up to competitions, weighing in, getting drug tested and leaving for the entire 18-month period at every single competition. Athletes have to actually total at 4 of the mandatory 6 competitions. And so this means that at the end of each 6-month period, athletes who have not participated in any competition will be eliminated from contention for an Olympic place. There are, however, a couple of exceptions. The first is that Japan, as a host country, is guaranteed some places, and also the Tripart Commission will allocate some wildcard slots at the end of qualification, which allow for kind of a reduced level of requirements for certain athletes. At the end of the 18-month qualification period, the plan was to take all of the athletes who had fulfilled the requirements and then just rank them using 4 of their best Roby performances. These 4 performances would be the best from each of the 6-month qualification periods plus their next best performance. Then athletes would be allocated to weight categories based on the best category that they had competed in at least twice. Only 1 athlete per country can qualify in each category, so all but the best from each category would be discounted at this stage. Places at the Olympics would then be offered to the top 8 athletes in the world in each category, plus the next highest in each continent outside of those top 8. These offers to all of the athletes would then need to be accepted by the National Olympic Committee of each country. And there are a couple of reasons why a country might actually decline a slot despite being given one. The first and main reason is that each country is only given a limit of 4 male and 4 female competitors altogether. And so countries who have qualified more athletes than 4 will have to decline slots and pick their top 4 athletes. Some countries have an even smaller limit of places, and that's basically as a punishment for anti-doping violations. Thailand, for example, has actually even withdrawn completely from qualifying due to a slew of anti-doping failures. Now, there is some speculation that China, for example, are going to use this as an option in order to send Liu Xiaojun in the men's 81 kilo category over Li Dayin, despite Li Dayin having more Roby points than Liu Xiaojun. Li Dayin will be offered a space due to having more Roby points, but they'll be able to decline it due to an injury and send Liu Xiaojun in his place. But of course, China can only do this because they have 2 athletes ranked so highly. In fact, right now they sit in position 1 and 2 in the Roby point rankings for the 81 kilo class. Most countries are not able to choose an athlete to send in an individual category. Once this first round of allocation is done, the process is repeated, reallocating any declined slots over and over again, basically, until all places are filled. Now, originally, this was all supposed to happen in May of 2020, a few months ago, directly after the completely hectic April that featured, of course, the 5 continental championships. And at Weightlifting House, we were actually all set up to be working crazy hours, covering all of the competitions, and continually then updating this ranking process as the reallocation period kept going round and round in May. And as we all know, the pandemic threw a huge spanner in the works of many things, including weightlifting. And it soon became clear that that final 6-month qualification period would not be completed, as loads of competitions were just cancelled or postponed. And then things changed even more when the IOC decided to postpone the Olympic Games by a year to 2021. So that third 6-month qualification period was initially supposed to run from November 2019 all the way up until the end of April 2020. But it was eventually decided that what they would do was to keep the existing scores from the third qualification period up until events and competitions started being cancelled, and then to extend it, adding an extra 7 months to it, running from October 2020, so in a couple months from now, all the way back around by a year to April 2021. And as a way, I guess, to make sure that athletes who had basically qualified even without those final continental championships that should have been last April don't just, disappear for a year and take loads of drugs and then compete at the Olympics, they've made it mandatory that every single athlete must compete in at least one, or at least participate in at least one of the competitions in this extended 7-month period that runs October 2020 to April 2021. It's worth mentioning that despite the IWF calendar looking relatively full at this point, not all competitions in this extended third period will count towards Olympic qualification. So the updated rules will allow for all the cancelled or postponed events that were going to be in the original period 3, and then also all sort of like-for-like substitution competitions. This means that all of the remaining competitions that every athlete will have to at least participate in will be made up of either those rearranged from earlier in the year or substitutes for them. Obviously, it still remains to be seen how many of those competitions will still go ahead and whether travel restrictions will just continually pose challenges for athletes. An example of that will be the upcoming European Championships, which are set to kick off in late October of this year in Moscow. There's a very good chance that that competition will be cancelled or postponed until later in this third qualification period. And the IWF has actually made one other change to the qualification system. So originally, if an athlete was able to qualify in more than one weight category, they would only be offered the spot in the category in which they performed the best in. Under these new revised rules, however, their National Olympic Governing Committee will be able to choose which category they want to select their athlete to compete in. So what does this mean for all of the athletes? Well, guys like Lasha Talakadze has the luxury of already scoring so many Roby points in his 6 competitions that he basically has his Olympic slot in the bag. In fact, I think I said in one of the previous weightlifting news show episodes, which is kind of remarkable, that if Lasha was to remove one of his 4 competition results, one of the 4 totals that he puts forward, he would still rank number 1 in that super heavyweight category. So for Lasha, he really does have the luxury of only needing to participate, and participate meaning simply weigh in and potentially get drug tested, in just one competition in this new extended third period from October 2020 to April 2021. So we very well may see him turn up and not compete, and the next time we're going to see him compete will be at the Olympic Games in the summer of 2021. Deng Wei, another example, the most dominant female weightlifter right now, is in a similar situation. We're not going to see her lift. We might see her, or we're going to have to see her at least turn up and weigh in. But we will only see her lift if her coaches think that it's going to help her with her Olympic qualification mindset performance. For many athletes, waiting that extra year is actually extremely difficult. You have to feel for someone like Lu Xiaojun, who at 36 years of age and is having to go through this ridiculously competitive qualification period, competing all the time, going up against a much younger Li Dayin. It's going to be really difficult for him, especially as he's been picking up more and more ongoing injuries over this 18-month period. For others, however, the disruption to the qualification period has actually really helped. Iran's Sarab Moradi, for example, basically looked dead and buried after an injury during the first qualification period. Despite scoring huge points, in fact something like 1,240 points with a world record total during the first qualification period, he then got injured and he was unable to get a decent score in the second of the 3 qualification periods. Moradi is basically left needing 2 enormous competitions in this third qualification period, and now this delayed, extended period gives him a much better chance to do that. And of course, for athletes who are sitting right on the cusp of the qualification spots in between maybe the 10th and 6th positioning, this extra time could either be a blessing or an absolute curse, depending on how they use it. Of course, many of them will be returning to competition after the longest gap they've ever had in competing, and so how they handle their preparation time now will be vital for how they return and attempt to qualify for the Olympics. So, assuming that there are no other crazy complications brought on by the pandemic and there are no further changes to the system required, here is what we expect to happen from here on out. There will be some competitions in late 2020, including that Continental European Championships that I mentioned that's kind of starting early November. The South American Championships also, which was postponed from March 2020, is currently planned for December of this year. And there will also likely be some competitions in early 2021. The East Asian Championship, for example, is scheduled for February, so that could be the first time we see Moradi put forward one of his 2 enormous competitions. The postponed Junior World Championships is set for March of 2021, and so that's going to give a bunch of the junior athletes another gold tier event and an opportunity to qualify points in their third period. And then it looks like April 2021 will feature the remaining postponed Continental Championships. The Pan American Championships is already scheduled to be in late April of 2021, and so it's very likely that the other continental federations will want to give their athletes a final gold tier event that month too, excluding of course the European Championships, which will be going ahead this November. And so it won't really be until May where most of the activity which confirms which of the athletes are going to be competing at the Olympics takes place. And in theory, this process could actually take us all the way through until the 5th of July, but we're kind of assuming that things will actually move a lot quicker. Countries will know who they think they're going to have qualified, who they're going to give places to, and everything will move a whole lot quicker than that. And of course, we're going to be covering all of the action on the Weightlifting House YouTube channel, the social media account, and of course the website. So make sure you subscribe to catch up with all of that. We'll be doing much more specific rundowns of individual countries trying to qualify, individual weight classes trying to qualify, and hopefully illuminate this whole process a whole lot more than the IWF currently has. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in, and hopefully you now understand how to qualify for the Olympics in weightlifting.